Hello there, U.S. history students, and welcome to Lecture 4 of Unit 4. Our topic today will be the strikes, early strikes of the first unions established in the United States. They were striving for better treatment, and this was kind of the last measure, last-ditch attempt for them to try to gain some respect from the employers and from the industrialists. But as we'll see as we go through this short lecture, that most of these strikes all ended up in them not getting what they wanted. They really didn't realize how to successfully initiate a strike, and most all of them ended in violence. And violence would be detrimental because for a strike to be successful, you need to gain the support of the public. And the public is never going to be sympathetic to violence and to a group that advocates violence. And in many cases, the strikers were not the ones that brought about the violence, but as a result of this violence, people were turned off by the unions and their methods, and industrialists found many ways to undercut the strikes and unions. Hopefully, in this lecture, I will refrain from using any words out of context like in the previous lecture that you so painfully made fun of me for. Anyway, moving on. As you can see by this graph here, strikes were growing as the decades of the late 1800s went by. In the early 1880s, the unions were just assembling, and there were some strikes that were occurring. But what happened in the 1890s was an economic depression. And so as a result, wages were cut even more. The owners were facing economic hardship, as were the people. And thus, the unions had gained more momentum by the 1890s, more membership. And as a result, you could see there were a significant amount of strikes that occurred during this time period. The first major strike, again, was at a time of economic downturn. There was a depression in the 1870s, which led owners to cut wages. They cut workers' wages by 10%. So the first strike was the Great Railroad Strike. And so these workers went on strike. And a couple of things. For a strike to be effective, you need the majority of the workers to walk out. You can't just have 50% of the workers walk out. Your union has to have solidarity. And for the most part, they did at this time, but the big thing was the government was not behind the strikers. So eventually, President Hayes ordered troops in to put an end to the strike. Violence was the result, and there were 100 killed in the melee that followed.
You held me down, but I got up. Get ready, 'cause I've had enough. I see it all, I see it now. I got the eye of the tiger, the fighter, dancing through the fire. 'Cause I am a champion, and you're gonna hear me roar.
Following the Great Railroad Strike was maybe the most famous strike of the early ones. In 1892, the Homestead Strike occurred. Homestead was in Pennsylvania. It was a company town in which Andrew Carnegie and some other steel owners, mainly Carnegie, had a monopoly on the steel industry. And this was near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, is where this strike broke out. And so again, there was an economic downturn, and as a result, Carnegie and his business manager, Henry Frick, decided to cut workers' wages by 20%. And the workers decided to go on strike. They had a fairly strong union there. Carnegie went off on a trip and ordered his business manager, no matter what, break this strike. And not only did he say that, but he basically told him, when this strike is over, I don't want any of these workers that went on strike to ever work for me again. And so Frick hired a group called the Pinkertons. They were detectives to come in and end the strike. There was a violent episode that ensued. Eventually, the state militia was called in to end the violence, and it ended poorly for the workers. Carnegie got his wish. None of the workers that had striked were ever hired back, and it was another failure for the workers to try to gain some power in the relationship with the business owners. Here you can see a few images from some of the early strikes, and as a result, most of them all are showing violence. And like I said before, violence is never good in a labor dispute because it loses support that you may have gained. No one feels sympathy or sorrow for you, and for you to be successful, that is something that you need to gain. The Pullman strike was another one that occurred in the 1890s. Pullman was a company town outside of Chicago, and they produced refrigerated railroad cars that could send cattle that had been butchered, anything that needed to be frozen. So, there was a fairly big demand for this. And Pullman was a company town, like I said, and so George Pullman was the name of the guy that had started it, and he owned all the stores and the houses and so forth in the town, and he charged his workers rent, and when he cut their wages, he didn't cut back on their expenses at all. So they decided to go on strike, and Eugene Debs was the leader of this strike, and he got the whole railroad union involved in the strike, and so railroad workers across the union refused to move trains that had Pullman cars attached to them. So basically what occurred was the nation's trains came to a standstill. And as a result of that, the U.S. mail was halted. Mail could not be delivered, as well as many other things. And so it was an inconvenience for, many Americans. President Grover Cleveland was in office at the time, and he saw that this was impacting America, and so he issued an injunction. Injunction is a court order to end a strike. So the strike came to an end. Eugene Debs was put in prison, and as a result, Cleveland saw this growing problem in the labor industry and all these strikes that were occurring, so he created a new cabinet position, the Department of Labor, which was to oversee the relationship between business owners and workers and try to solve some of these problems before they resulted in strikes. Finally, this one occurred a little bit later on when Teddy Roosevelt was president, and the significance of the anthracite coal strike was, for the first time, the government sided with the workers. Not completely with the workers. These were miners that went on strike, and they demanded a pay raise, and Teddy Roosevelt stepped in, and they did. The miners did receive some sort of pay raise. It's not all that they wanted, but significantly you could see a transformation occurring here, where the government, who all along prior to this had always sided with the industrialists, now there was a change. New age of politics coming in, which would lead to the progressive era, in which government would be more concerned with the lower class and more concerned with the workers, and not just aiding the industrialists in the era which they had dominated so greatly. So these are the first few strikes that occurred, and again, very few of them were successful because they had a lot of odds. The workers had a lot of odds stacked against them. And the last thing I want to do in this lecture is take a look at reasons why the early unions didn't experience all that much success. The owners did many things to prevent the unions from becoming powerful, because they realized the more powerful the union, the higher wages they were going to have to pay, the less control they had over their workers, and so on. So the first thing they established was a policy called blacklisting. Blacklisting was if you joined a union, your name was put on a list, it was sent around, you might be fired, it was sent around to other employers, and it prevented you from getting another job. And so, again, not great, a way to deter workers from joining a union. Yellow dog contracts were contracts that owners forced workers to sign stating they would not join a union. It was a condition for their employment. Unions often resorted to violence early on. When there's a labor dispute and you might go on strike, and then they have some workers crossing the picket line, or they're hiring replacement workers, that can be a very emotional time, and people are very passionate, and as a result violence broke out, which didn't help out their cause any. Also, the government sided with owners in most of the early labor disputes. The government was on the side of the industrialists, and so the workers didn't have much support or anything to lean on. And finally, one of the main factors that leads to union success is a high percentage of workers joining the union. And the early unions did not have enough workers that joined. The owners had very little trouble finding replacement workers because most of these jobs were unskilled labor. It was not difficult. It'd be like at McDonald's. If you're working at McDonald's and you demand a raise from your boss to $10 an hour, $15 an hour, whatever it is, it's not going to be difficult for your boss to find somebody to replace you. So you're not going to have much ground to stand on. So the early unions set the stage for later development for better treatment of workers, and it's still an issue today. There's long history of labor union in this country. Today, only 15% of Americans belong to unions. Right now, we're in a period of time where union membership is declining somewhat. There's some negativity out there about unions, but they have had a significant impact on American history, and being there to stand up for the lower class at a time when it was necessary.